So how we seek information, not only we're victim of the information, but we also go out and get the information. And so we need to figure out ways of, we have to understand how we seek out and how we interpret this information. And from the very, very get-go, I talked about how we kind of suck at humans because we have this confirmation bias. We will seek out the information to validate and to support our preconceived ideas and so on. So this will leave us to believe things that we already kind of believe. Now, the other second component of the confirmation bias is that we will leave out and we will deliberately ignore information that disconfirms our belief. And so the confirmation bias is bad in two ways. Not only do we seek out the information that we want to hear, but we also do not look at the information that we don't want to hear. So, for example, a Republican will only read Republican news and never, ever, ever read or listen to the Democratic news. Now, it's different in Canada because we don't have this polarization of like these two candidates. Will a Liberal candidate listen to an NDP kind of speech? Yeah, very likely. So there's this kind of, I don't think it's the same in Canada in terms of political degree or political dichotomy, but that's kind of like basically the argument or the example of a confirmation bias, where we will seek out information and also deliberately ignore and not look. And this is one of the reasons why I think diversity. So, we've all been talking about, or not all, but talking about diversity has become more and more mainstream, the EDI initiatives and so on. And I think that one of the reasons why diversity is good, one reason why diversity is good is because it provides this positive and potentially the exposure to information that might disconfirm your belief. And so if we're never exposed to any other information, we will never be exposed to that information. Therefore, we can't ignore it if it's not even around. Now, diversity kind of at least it puts people with diverse viewpoints, diverse opinions, diverse ways of being and ways of living together. And I might start by ignoring the information in the beginning because it doesn't kind of fit, but eventually it might seep in and eventually I might actually catch on to something that's actually more similar. The other thing is that we think that diversity is actually different, but a lot of time diversity is just different similarities. It's just different ways of being similar to someone else without even knowing. And so that's why I think that diversity is great, is because it helps limit or mitigate this motivation we have of ignoring and failing to attend to other types of information. And our confirmation bias is sometimes motivated. So our confirmation bias happens oftentimes, naturally or automatically, but sometimes our confirmation bias is actually motivated by certain beliefs or certain values or certain kind of context. And so supporters and opponents of supporters and opponents of the death penalty in the States were given the same evidence. So the same text, the same vignette, and both groups read statements about the effectiveness and the ineffectiveness of the death penalty. However, both groups interpreted the information very differently. And so they said, you see, therefore, obviously it's good, or obviously it's bad, or, they discounted the bad or the good. So I won't get to the details of what they did, but basically, because of their fundamental value of death penalty or belief in death penalty, they actually interpreted the same information following what they want to maintain as their belief. And so the idea is that if you want to maintain your belief, if you're fundamentally convinced by your value, fundamentally convinced by your belief, you will be motivated to maintain that belief and maintain that, and therefore you will use your confirmation bias, your motivated confirmation bias, to interpret that information. And you see this all the time. You've got Group A versus Group B, or the activists versus the government, and they're both talking talking about, climate change or climate modification or climate whatever. And they're both using the same data, but they're reinterpreting the data differently so that it fits with their belief. Now, motivated confirmation bias really stems from maintaining one's belief, which comes back to this equilibrium bias, right? Where humans want to maintain belief. They want things to be in homeostasis. That means, kind of being in balance with each other. We don't like to change our thoughts and change our values very quickly, as it's hard and so on. And so we're very good at convincing ourselves of things that we want to believe. That's basically the motivated confirmation bias. And so when processing this information, we can either use a bottom-up process, which is data-driven. You might have seen this in some of your cognitive classes, where you see a stimulus, you see multiple stimuli. That is data-driven information. I see something blue, and that light frequency hits my eye, and so on. So that's bottom-up. And then you have top-down processing, which is basically theory-driven mental processing. So I'm using something in my head to influence and to interpret the information that's in front of me. One great example of this top-down processing is schemas. Now, I don't have to tell you what schemas are, because we've already seen this. So these knowledge structures that exist in our mind are these organized bodies of information. That is a great example of top-down processing. We use these schemas to interpret the information and to, come to judgments about the information that's presented in front of us, or, of other people. And so here I am going to tell you, or I'm going to show you one quick example. So let's see if this is going to work. Just follow the video. Count how many times the players wearing the white pass the basketball. So players in white, count the number of times they pass their basketball. So, how many passes did you count? Correct answer is 15. Good on ya. Well done. Now, the question is, did you see a gorilla? Back up. If I ask you, did you see this originally? If you've never seen this video, it's highly possible that you didn't see the gorilla. Obviously, if you've seen this video, you know exactly what we're talking about. So this is an example, believe it or not, of schemas, because what I told you is to pay attention to I guided your attention to the white people, or actually I didn't guide you, but the researchers guided you to focusing on the people in white and counting their passes. And so schemas is one way of thinking of it. Schemas is one way of understanding how attention works, because you were focused on white players. That means that you're not looking at black gorillas. And so because counting number of passes for white people is kind of the schema in your head is, well, you've got humans in white t-shirts passing balls. Black gorillas is not part of that schema, and therefore you might not have seen the black gorilla because you weren't looking for it. It wasn't in your schema. And so this is a kind of a fun way of indicating how activating a schema influences how you perceive the information. Now, if you want to go back again and have a look at the video, this time you will very likely see the gorilla, because you know that it's there, and now passing the white ball amongst people includes gorilla passing through the group, that you've added this information to the schema. And so, one of the reasons why we pay attention to schemas and why we're interested in schemas is because schemas, as a top-down processing influencer, influences our memory. And so, depending on the schema that we have activated, depending on the schema that we have or that we use to interpret this information, will influence how we encode the information and how we retrieve the information. And so encoding the information using one schema will influence the information that we experience, and it also influences the way that we will retrieve that information or kind of get that information back from our memory bank. Schemas will also influence the way that we understand or that we construe or that we make inferences about the information. So we will very likely interpret the information consistent with our schema. Just like the gorilla example, the attention, white t-shirts does not involve gorillas, black gorillas. Therefore, you won't see a gorilla in there because that's kind of what you have in your head. So you will use a schema in your head to interpret the information that you have, depending on your past experience. Now, for example, where this actually kind of comes into play quite importantly is new information or future information is usually interpreted with the schemas that we've used or that we've drum up through past experiences. So if you've experienced many, many exams as terrible stressors and very, very difficult, you'll have the schema in your head of exams are terrible stressors. They're not fun. If you've been okay with exams and you've fared okay with exams, you'll interpret the future exams or examinations or evaluations as a challenge. It's kind of like, well, it's kind of a fact of life and I have to test my knowledge and so on. And so interpreting an exam as being either a challenge or the death of me kind of influences or is influenced by the schema that you have of what are exams and what are evaluations. Just like if you've experienced terrible first dates and you've been rejected many times in first dates or blind dates or whatever, versus if you've had pleasant first dates in the past, you will interpret future first dates either as, here we go, another chance to be rejected, another chance for me to fail, or you'll say, actually, at the very least, I'll meet someone new, hopefully, or I'll just meet a new person. It doesn't have to be my partner in life. At least I'll have a good time with meeting someone, new. And so that kind of depends on what you have in your schema, what schema you have about meeting new people or meeting a date partner or a dating partner. So you see how when we talk about mindsets, when we talk about your frame of mind, schemas is, for example, an example of what mindset you're using or what frame of mind are you using to interpret and to live your life. It's not very easy to change your mindsets and not very easy to change your schemas, but that's identifying that this exists and that it can be changed. That's kind of an important step for all of us. So schemas are mainly the driving force behind priming. So we briefly talked about priming. There's certain examples of primings that we used in the past for in the course with studies that we described. But priming is basically the activation of a schema. It's bringing to mind a concept or a schema that you have. We might share similar schemas, sort of like gratitude or happiness, is relatively kind of, not universal, but, we have a more similar idea of happiness, and relationships might be a very different schema. So we can prime person-specific schema, so your schema for exams, for example, or we can activate sort of more general, kind of more diffuse or more generalized schemas, such as happiness or sadness or whatever, different emotions. And so by priming, what we want to do is we want to temporarily bring to mind or activate this idea. And the idea behind priming is that once you've activated this schema, once you've activated this information, this will influence how you interpret information down the road or, down the line. And so there are two main types of primes or two different levels of primes. There are supraliminal primes. So there are within the conscious awareness. Therefore, you're not telling the person this is what I'm doing. But they're usually reading something, and then in the text there are certain words that obviously the person is consciously reading because they have to read the text. And they're within the text there are multiple kind of positive adjectives, and so they're reading the text consciously, obviously, and they're reading good, generous, polite, and so on. So you're activating the concept of politeness or good or positivity. So examples are scrambled sentences, screensavers, posters on walls. So you come into a research wall and they're like, there's a death metal poster versus a Barney poster. Like you see it, you don't really make much of it, but you still kind of see it. Flags in the background, motivation partner posters on your wall, for example, in your bedroom if you ever have them, or in your lab or whatever. So these are all things that you see consciously, but they're kind of like, they're there, but you don't really pay much attention. And then there's subliminal priming. Subliminal priming is totally out of one's awareness. So it is flashes on screen. These are things that you hardly don't see. Your brain sees it, your consciousness sees it, your unconsciousness sees it, but your consciousness does not see it. So usually when we talk about subliminal priming, we're talking about computer screens flashing or things appearing extremely fast, and it is totally without the participant's conscious awareness. So can priming affect behavior? For example, so Barge Chen is one of the authors of the book. They used scrambled sentence, which is a supraliminal prime. Anyways, we'll get through it. To either prime rudeness, politeness, or neutral. So the participants, what they had to do is they had to unscramble. Oh, you don't see my. I don't think you see my. You don't see my pointer. That's fine. So they had to unscramble. They had to unscramble these sentences. So, for example, in the first example, you see actress good, the well did. So the person had to unscramble these sentences to make the following sentence: the actress did good. So they had 30 sentences similar to that, with positive attitude or positive examples. And then the rude group had very similar sentences, except the sentences would be the actress is rude, and then the last group was the actress wore a blue dress. So you're doing this, obviously you're focused on the words, you're focused on unscrambling these words to make, but by doing that, so it's kind of like magic or illusions, we're pulling your attention this way, on this side, but indirectly you're reading through these sentences you're reading through these sentences, and in the end, you've read, 30 sentences that are related to good things, rude things, or kind of neutral things. And so they've done that, and then they had participants kind of put up, or made to be ignored. So they would then measure the time it took the participants to actually intrude or to interrupt the experimenter, to say, well, what's the next task? Like, I'm waiting here. What am I supposed to do? And so on. And so the hypothesis was, like, what is the likelihood of different groups? What's the likelihood of, first of all, the participants interrupting the experimenter, and then second of all, how much time or how long would it take for them to interrupt? And so in the polite group, it's about 17 minutes. The neutral group, about percent. This is the number of, not the time, but this is the percent of participants that interrupted. And then in the rude group, 64% of the participants interrupted. So the idea here is that by having this schema of rude, this concept of rude in my head, when I'm placed in a situation where I can be rude, where I might be rude, where it might be beneficial for me to be rude, then I will use that concept, I will use that schema to kind of, enact on that. And so the idea here is that activating the schemas differentially influence people's behavior, and they didn't know that, they were manipulated or they were influenced in this way. And so this is one way that we study, or that we see how schemas indirectly or supraliminally or subliminally influence our behavior. And so Activating schemas actually can happen multiple different ways. They can be recent activations of schemas. So we can self-activate schemas. So a lot of times when we do our kind of like a little motivational speak, or we psych ourselves up, that's kind of one way of kind of like, activating the positive schema of, okay, you can do this, it's fine, you're okay, you'll be okay. The other aspects of schemas that we pay attention to is the frequency and the chronic accessibilities of the schemas. And so people differ in the number of times that schemas are activated, and the greater the number of times, then you start talking about a chronic activation of schemas. And when you start talking about chronic activation of schemas, that's when you get into like personality disorders or personality vulnerabilities, low self-esteem, anxiety, attachment issues, and so on. And so one of the common kind of theories, I guess, explaining low self-esteem is that for people with low self-esteem, it's very easy for them, they remember being rejected more frequently, or they can remember frequent activations of being rejected, and therefore they remember being activated more frequently, and to the point where if they constantly and chronically activate the schema of low self-esteem, then they actually kind of keep spiraling down. Same with anxiety. It's this constant chronic accessibility and frequent activation of life being scary. And so the problem with all this is that the more you think about it, the more you think that it's true. So again, this is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy or a downward spiral, where the frequent activation of these schemas become almost your reality, and then you can't really think of anything else because that's the only thing that is you think is reality. And hence that's why it's sometimes really kind of hard to snap out of it, or to kind of reframe people's schemas, or to reframe the reality. So we briefly talked about dual processing theory, and I forget which the class, but we'll just briefly go through it because it's very important in understanding, priming and heuristics and thin slicing and snap judgment and all this social cognition stuff. Basically, the theory or the idea is that we've got two main systems. We've got system one, which is the intuitive system. It's very quick. It's rapid responses, and a lot of the stuff that we do happens intuitively. Simultaneously. So that was the example that I used for multitasking. So you can multitask if you can automatize your tasks. For example, playing piano or playing any kind of, sport. Obviously, you're running and looking and doing all sorts of stuff at the same time. The other system is the rational system, is a slow system. It's the controlled system. It's system 2. So this is the one that, makes deductions, judgments, at least conscious judgment. And this is also the reason why I said multitasking in task doesn't work, because you can't listen and take notes and understand the material and respond to your Facebook or your text at the same time. It doesn't work. You have to pick one. And so, if I were to ask you, I'll show you an image, and I'll ask you for if you pick a red ball, I will give you $100. Now, try to make a decision as quickly as possible. Would you take small little left ball, or would you pick out of the large right ball? Now, most of you would very likely intuitively pick out of the large red ball. Why? Because it looks like there's a lot more red balls, therefore you've got greater chance of getting $100. Now, if you actually count the gray balls, you'll find that the small ball actually has got better odds in the small bowl than in the large bowl. Now, our intuitive system, or system 1, makes these snap judgments, makes these kind of very quick kind of evaluations of, there seems to be more red balls, therefore this must be a better chance. And so that's an example of intuition versus reasoning. Same with this next example. If we flip the coin 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, and we have 5 heads, what is the chance of us flipping? Sorry, that's not the right question. What do you think will be most likely to happen for the next flip? Heads or tails? Now, you might intuitively say, well, it's kind of time for the tails now to happen because, we've had 5 heads back to back 5 times. So it's kind of like, there are greater chance of tails happening than heads. Now, if you think about it, every time you flip a coin, you're just as likely to hit a head than a tails. So there could be another heads, no problem. And there's not more chances than hitting a head or flipping a head than flipping a tails. However, our intuition is saying, well, there seems to be a non-random kind of flow here, and therefore it must be a tails that's coming up. And so we would probably bet more money on a tail coming up than a heads. Even though the chances of flipping a head and a tails is 50-50. So this is another example of our intuition kind of saying, yeah, but it's not quite right. And then a reason saying, wait a minute, flipping heads or tails is a 50-50 chance. So there's no reason why we should think this way. And that's kind of an example of system 1, system 2, or, this rapid kind of intuitive system and this kind of controlled, slower rational system. Which brings us to heuristics. So we'll end with the concept of heuristics for today. And so heuristics are similar to snap judgments, to thin slicing, to quick judgments. But heuristics are kind of like these models, this intuitive mental operations. So it stems mainly from the intuitive system, so system 1, that are performed quickly and automatically, that help us answer common questions and kind of come to judgments relatively quickly. Now, whether those judgments are good or bad or right or wrong, that's a whole other question. But heuristics are snap judgments, quick judgments to help us come to decisions or to help us come to judgments relatively quickly. And the two families of heuristics that'll finish with are the first family is availability heuristics. So the concept of availability heuristics is judgments of frequencies or probability are based on the readiness, on the activation, on the availability of pertinent information coming to mind. So if you can think of, for example, what's more probable, a massive snowstorm in St. John's or a massive snowstorm in Halifax? Some of you might say, well, obviously, there's a much greater chance of having a massive snowstorm in St. John's. Why? Because we lived through Snowmageddon 2 years ago. Snowmageddon might still be in your psyche or your memory, or you just can't remember of a massive snowstorm in Halifax. And therefore, if you can't remember a time when Halifax had a massive snowstorm, then you say, well, obviously it'd be St. John's. So the sheer fact of having stuff in the news, having stuff reiterated to you, or you remembering schemas being reactivated. So all this stuff that comes back to mind, if you can reactivate or make that information more available, that will influence your heuristic. Your judgment of that event. And like I mentioned here, chronically accessible schemas are one example in the social world where we're using this chronically accessible information that will influence the way that we interpret or we expect stuff to happen. So if I'm anxious at parties and I don't like parties and I don't behave very friendly and I'm kind of like socially awkward at parties, then I've got this schema of like parties are no fun. And so if you ask me what's the probability that I'll have fun at this party, I'll use this chronically accessible information and available information that, like 0. I will definitely not have fun at this party. And because I'm worried about, people staring at my Barry Manilow t-shirt, or because I've never really had fun at parties. And so the fact that we build this kind of alternate reality in our head influences the way that we'll expect and that we'll interpret future information and current information. Obviously, people that I've been with at different parties, if they say, well, no, he was fine, he was just... I would have liked to kind of ask them about such and such and such. It's like, they might not see me as socially anxious, but I've constructed this idea that I am socially anxious at parties, and I don't have fun at parties. And so that's one example of this kind of like this go-between between, you know, our internal reality, external reality, and then the judgments that we make and the snap judgments that we make about future stuff, which really affect, you know, our behaviors. And so, for example, another example of availability heuristics is that if you ask the chances of or the perceived the perceived number of deaths caused by, you know, motor accidents, tornadoes. So people overemphasize or overestimate the number of people that are killed in motor accidents and tornadoes, flood, blah, 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 because they're more in the news, because, you know, accidents of, you might know someone that's been in a motor accident. You might know someone that's lived a flood or has had cancer or had a, you know, fire. You might not necessarily know as many people have diabetes or have, you know, been hit by lightning or had a stroke, asthma, and so on. So the fact that it's easier for us, and it's the information that's other types of deaths are more available to us, makes us overjudge or overestimate the frequency of that happening. The second and last heuristic is representativeness heuristic. Representativeness heuristic. So this is the process by which we judge the likelihood based on the assessments of similarity between individuals and groups prototypes. And between the cause and effect. So basically, if someone represents a prototype, if we discriminate, if we stereotype, if this is a good representation of the thing that I think it is, then it's much more likely to happen. If this is not a good representation of what I think is going to happen, then it's unlikely to happen. So the faster and the easier it is for you to think of a representative of this happening or of this being representative of the cause and effect, then the more likely you think it is actually going to happen. So for example, one example of representative heuristics are stereotypes. You know, you look at someone, he's clean cut, he's smart, he must be a doctor. He represents my schema of what a doctor looks like, and therefore it's very likely that he is a doctor. Now, we have no reason to believe why he should be a doctor versus any other profession. And so the fact of the matter is that, you know, it's not how you dress that dictates your profession. It's just that we have this heuristic, this representation of, okay, so doctors maybe are more clean cut and more, you know, smart than other people. And I will leave you with this last riddle, I guess. If you've seen the riddle, if you've heard this riddle, then it won't work for you. But if you haven't seen the riddle, then I think this is an interesting kind of way of kind of combating our representativeness heuristic. So imagine a father and son were in a car accident where the father was killed. The ambulance brought the son to the hospital. He needed immediate surgery. In the operating room, the doctor came in and looked at the little boy and said, "I can't operate on him. He is my son. Who is the doctor?" I leave with that, and we will see you next week. Bye.